Ivan Bolotnikov. Who was this man whose name became a symbol of rebellion and bloody anarchy during the time of troubles? Merely a military serf of Prince Telyatevsky, essentially his military property. Fate tossed him from one hardship to another. Capture by Tatars, slavery in the Ottoman Empire, grueling labor on galleys. But even there, in a foreign land, he survived, escaped, and by some miracle made his way to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It was there, on Polish soil, that he met Mikhail Molchanov, the very adventurer who had once fled Moscow with Marina Minishek after the death of the first false Dmitry. It was Molchanov, a deceiver and schemer, who convinced Bolotnikov, the true Tsar Dmitry Ivanovich is alive, and he awaits your service. Blinded by this lie, or perhaps desperate to find his place in the world, Bolotnikov took on the role of Tsar's voivode. He issued a call, and thousands flocked to him. Runaway serfs, Cossacks, peasants, and nobles dissatisfied with Shuisky. This was not an army in the usual sense, but a seething torrent of rage and hope, driven by a single elusive idea: the revival of the good Tsar. Under his leadership, this force swept across the southern borders, destroying everything in its path, and soon laid siege to Moscow. Ivan Bolotnikov, a former slave and galley oarsman, became the de facto leader of a grand uprising that shook the very foundations of the Russian state. He was not just a leader, he became a living banner of chaos, the embodiment of popular anger that seemed poised to sweep away what little order remained. But a force deprived of clear purpose and unified will is doomed. Bolotnikov's rebellion, despite initial successes, was destined for defeat. Vasily Shuisky's forces, though with difficulty, managed to turn the tide. Bolotnikov was cornered in Tula, where, after a grueling siege, he surrendered under a promise of pardon. A promise that, as was often the case during the time of troubles, was instantly broken. He was blinded, and then, according to some accounts, drowned, according to others, hanged. An end worthy of tragedy. And it is here that the myth of the peasant leader, a fighter for the people's truth, crumbles. Ivan Bolotnikov was merely an instrument, albeit an incredibly powerful one, in the hands of those who sought to exploit popular discontent for their own, far more pragmatic ends. He was not an ideological revolutionary. He was a victim of others' intrigues, and his own despair, thrown into the maelstrom of the great troubles. But what drove this man, a former slave who had lost everything, to assume such an incredible role? And crucially, why did he, having passed through the hell of slavery and survived, prove so susceptible to others' lies? The answer lies deep within his personal tragedy, in the traumas that shaped his personality, and in the environment that stripped him of all support. Ivan Bolotnikov was born a military serf, meaning he did not belong to himself from birth. His life was not his property, but the property of the prince, his master. This was not merely a low social status. It was the absence of a self, the absence of will, the absence of a future that could be built. Such a person, deprived of freedom of choice from infancy, was destined to seek external guidance, to submit to another's will. And so, when this property fell into Tatar captivity, and then into the brutal slavery of the Ottoman Empire, to the galleys, his personality passed through a crucible that left nothing unchanged. Galley servitude was not just a physical ordeal. It was a complete, absolute deprivation of human dignity. Every day, the same grueling, monotonous labor under the lash, in inhumane conditions, with a constant sense of impending death. In such an environment, only those who could shut off their emotions, who transformed into a mechanism, a function, survived. Bolotnikov survived, but at what cost? He escaped, yes, but to where? To the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a foreign country where he was nobody, without connections, without a name, without means of subsistence. He was free, but this freedom turned out to be a terrifying emptiness, a vacuum that needed to be filled. It was at this moment, when his soul was maximally devastated and vulnerable, that Mikhail Molchanov appeared on his path. Molchanov, a cynical adventurer, perfectly understood the psychology of such people. He didn't just offer Bolotnikov the idea of a miraculously saved Tsar. He offered him a new life, a new identity, a new purpose. For a man who had been someone else's property his entire life, and then a faceless slave, the offer to become a Tsar's voivode was not just a chance for a change of fortune. It was a chance to find meaning, to exact revenge on the world that had crushed him. The true Tsar Dmitry Ivanovich is alive. This phrase for Bolotnikov was not just a lie, but a lifeline. It gave him not only legitimacy, but also inner support. He could finally stop being an anonymous slave and become someone significant, even if that significance was built on the greatest mystification. The point of no return was crossed here. When Bolotnikov not only believed in another's lie, but accepted it as the only possible truth for himself, as the foundation of his new, albeit false, existence. He became a banner, and this banner, woven from his own traumas and others' intrigues, led millions. The Russian Tsardom, to which Bolotnikov returned, was a country on the brink of collapse. The death of the last Rurikid, Fyodor Ivanovich, ended a centuries-old dynasty, plunging the state into an unprecedented abyss of uncertainty. Boris Godunov ascended the throne, whose legitimacy, not supported by blood ties to previous rulers, was constantly challenged. This created deep distrust of central authority, fueling rumors and conspiracies. Political upheavals were followed by economic catastrophe. The early 17th century was marked by a series of terrible crop failures, resulting in the Great Famine, which claimed millions of lives. People died by the thousands, cities emptied, and villages turned to ruins. The survivors, driven to despair, abandoned their lands, swelling the ranks of runaway peasants and serfs. Estates were ruined, the treasury dwindled, and the already heavy peasant burden became unbearable. Social contradictions sharpened to the limit. Peasants, increasingly drawn into serfdom, sought salvation on the peripheries, where free Cossack communities offered the illusion of freedom. These Cossacks, long a significant military force, did not recognize Moscow's authority, living by their own laws and attracting all the discontented. The nobility, once the throne's support, split into warring factions, each seeking to seize its share of power and influence, resorting to any means. The appearance of the first false Dmitry, his rapid ascent and equally sudden fall, followed by the enthronement of Vasily Shuisky, elected by only a narrow group of boyars, finally undermined the last vestiges of stability. None of these rulers possessed unconditional support from either the people or the elite. Power hung by a thread, and the state machine faltered at all levels. The country was exhausted, drained, and tormented. Hatred for the boyars, distrust of any form of authority, a sense of abandonment and hopelessness permeated all strata of society. The air was thick with the scent not just of change, but of complete destruction. In such an atmosphere, where rational arguments lost all meaning, any spark could ignite a fire, and any, even the most absurd, hope for a true Tsar, capable of restoring order and justice, found resonance in the hearts of millions. This was the fertile ground upon which Bolotnikov's rebellion arose. On this exhausted, contradiction-ridden soil, the seeds of deception fell and yielded abundant shoots. Bolotnikov himself, having assumed the role of Tsar's voivode, was not the inventor of the main mystification, but became its most powerful mouthpiece. His strength lay in the continuous dissemination of one great lie. The true sovereign, Dmitry Ivanovich, is alive, hiding somewhere in the southwest, gathering forces for his return. This deception became the backbone of the rebellion, its fuel and justification. In the name of the miraculously saved Tsar, charters were sent throughout the country. Calls for a general uprising, for the ruthless extermination of boyars, nobles, and government officials, for the establishment of a new, just order. These forged messages, often written by the skillful hand of Mikhail Molchanov and his henchmen, were not distinguished by their elegant style, but they were strikingly effective. They struck directly at the heart of popular aspirations, at the deeply rooted belief in a good Tsar capable of restoring violated justice, and at the burning hatred for those whom the people believed were responsible for their suffering. The charters promised complete freedom from serfdom, land, and wealth, asserting that Dmitry Ivanovich himself favored those who rebelled against the boyar Tsar, Vasily Shuisky. Thus, step by step, the first, most massive deception unfolded, turning despair into a weapon. But the mere illusion of a distant savior was not enough. To give the deception a tangible form, new actors were introduced to the political stage, playing their roles in this ominous spectacle. The most significant among them was a certain Ileka Muromets, an adventurer from Murom who claimed to be Tsarevich Peter, allegedly the miraculously saved son of Tsar Fyodor Ivanovich, the last of the Rurikid dynasty. This was a blatant, brazen lie. The real Tsarevich Peter had died in infancy, and there was no basis for such a legend. However, in an atmosphere of total distrust and despair, where any hope seemed salvific, this forgery gained incredible power. False Peter did not just join Bolotnikov. He brought with him significant detachments of Don Cossacks, who, being free people and far from Moscow's intrigues, either sincerely believed in his Tsarist origin or saw him as a convenient flag for their own freebooting. Now the rebellion had not only the voivode of the true Tsar, but also the Tsar's son in its ranks, which greatly enhanced its appeal and legitimacy in the eyes of the broad popular masses, especially on the southern peripheries, where the authority of the central government was minimal. This was the second, no less cynical deception, designed to materialize the myth and give it a face. These two key deceptions, the invisible true Tsar and the tangible Tsarevich, became a powerful catalyst, transforming scattered pockets of discontent into a unified, crushing torrent. They gave the chaotic mass of rebels what they never had: legitimacy, purpose, and most importantly, hope. Under the banners of these deceptions, driven by faith in the myth of the good sovereign, the rebellious force surged towards Moscow, sweeping away everything that still clung to the fragile pillars of state power. This was not merely a war for power, but a war for an illusion, which, as it turned out, was stronger than any reality. But how did this former slave, lacking formal education and military experience, manage to transform an ephemeral lie into a crushing force leading tens of thousands? Ivan Bolotnikov was not merely an executor of another's will. He became a masterful manipulator, whose methods were astonishingly effective in conditions of total chaos. His strength lay not in eloquence or strategic genius, but in an intuitive understanding of the psychology of a desperate crowd and a remarkable ability to adapt to any role. Instead of traditional charisma, based on noble birth or outstanding talents, Bolotnikov possessed a different, far more potent appeal. His charisma was that of a survivor, a man who had passed through the hell of slavery and emerged not broken, but tempered. For the hungry, humiliated peasants and serfs driven to the brink, he was the living embodiment of their own pain and hope for retribution. He didn't play a role, he embodied it, and this genuine despair, mixed with a will to live, was transmitted without words. He skillfully used this image, becoming a kind of mirror in which every rebel saw his own thirst for justice and revenge. His methods of influence were primitive, but unfailing. First and foremost, it was a play on the lowest, yet strongest, human instincts: greed, fear, and the desire for freedom. The true Tsar's charters, distributed in his name, did not merely call for rebellion. They promised unprecedented blessings, complete freedom, land, wealth confiscated from the boyars. Bolotnikov did not invent these promises, but he was their chief guarantor, the man through whom the Tsar's will reached the people. He skillfully fueled these expectations, transforming abstract hope into a concrete, tangible incentive for action. The creation of excitement and the maintenance of faith in the true Tsar were achieved through the constant appearance of new experts and witnesses. Although Bolotnikov himself was not an intellectual, he surrounded himself with people capable of managing information and perception. Mikhail Molchanov was not the only one. Other adventurers joined the rebellion, each bringing their share of proof of the Tsar's survival or new Tsar's decrees. The appearance of false Peter, whom Bolotnikov not only accepted but actively promoted, became the culmination of this strategy. He gave the invisible Tatar a son, lending the myth even greater credibility and visibility. This was a conscious policy of creating a multi-layered, constantly evolving legend that kept popular enthusiasm from waning. Bolotnikov's personal ability to adapt to changing circumstances was phenomenal. From a faceless slave, he transformed into a military commander capable of leading a motley, poorly disciplined army. He learned on the fly, quickly mastering the basics of military affairs, logistics, and crowd psychology. He skillfully navigated the interests of various groups within his camp: Cossacks, nobles, peasants, each pursuing their own goals. He was not just a leader, but also a mediator, preventing this explosive mixture from disintegrating. It was this incredible plasticity and willingness to assume any role the situation demanded that allowed him to become not just a leader, but a living catalyst and mirror of an era in which illusion was stronger than reality. However, behind this Tsar's voivode, behind his every action, stood far more powerful and cynical forces that profited from the general chaos. Mikhail Molchanov, the adventurer who convinced Bolotnikov, was not just a chance companion or a minor intriguer. He was a key link in a chain of much larger conspiracies, pursuing not only personal gain, but also the interests of his patrons. His flight to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth after the death of the first false Dmitry was not an escape, but a strategic retreat, where he quickly became a tool in the hands of the Polish gentry and King Sigismund III Vasa himself. For Warsaw, a weakened and internally divided Russia presented a tempting prize, an opportunity to expand borders, assert Catholicism, and possibly install its own protégé on the Moscow throne. Molchanov, like other runaway adventurers, supplied information, spread rumors, and recruited supporters, creating fertile ground for future interventions. He was not only the author of the myth of the miraculously saved Tsar, but also its chief manager, receiving funding and support to fuel the flame of rebellion from within. But it was not only external forces that benefited from this turmoil. Within Russia itself, in the shadow of the rebellion, various interest groups were operating, ready to dance on the bones of the dying state. The southern nobility, dissatisfied with the strengthening of central authority and the loss of liberties, saw Bolotnikov's rebellion as a chance to reclaim lost privileges and redistribute lands in their favor. They joined the rebels not out of faith in the Tsarevich, but out of pure pragmatism, hoping for new positions and wealth. The Don and Volga Cossacks, eternal seekers of freedom and plunder, gladly joined any movement that promised them independence from Moscow's orders and the opportunity for unpunished looting. For them, Bolotnikov was merely a convenient flag under which they could legitimize their raids and expand their influence. And at the other end of this bloody thread, in the very center of besieged Moscow, stood Tsar Vasily Shuisky, the main antagonist of this drama. His position was unenviable. Having ascended the throne after the assassination of the first false Dmitry, he possessed neither the dynastic legitimacy of the Rurikids nor broad popular support. He was a boyar Tsar, elected by a narrow circle of conspirators, and this stigma haunted him throughout his reign. Shuisky desperately tried to consolidate his power, but every action, from repressions to attempts to rely on foreign mercenaries, only deepened distrust and fueled rumors of his illegitimacy. Bolotnikov's rebellion became an existential threat to him, exposing the fragility of his power. He was forced to fight not only with the rebel army, but also with the ghost of the true Tsar, which no military means could defeat. His struggle was a struggle for the survival of the state, but also a struggle for his own, extremely precarious, crown. Thus, in the crucible of the time of troubles, Ivan Bolotnikov found himself at the center of a complex intertwining of others' interests, Polish ambitions, the Russian elite's thirst for power, and Tsar Shuisky's desperate attempt to hold on to a crumbling state. He was a pawn, but a pawn capable of moving an entire empire. However, illusion, no matter how powerful, could not last forever. The walls of Moscow, which seemed on the verge of falling under the onslaught of tens of thousands of rebels, became the first frontier where the lie began to crack. The siege of the capital, which began in October 1606, dragged on. And although new detachments continued to flock to Bolotnikov's banner, including noble militias from southern cities, the lack of a unified goal, other than an abstract belief in a good czar, and the motley nature of the army began to show. The culmination came at the most inopportune moment. The southern nobility, who had initially joined Bolotnikov for purely pragmatic reasons, hoping for land redistribution, new positions, and the weakening of serfdom, were the first to see the light, or rather, to realize the unviability of the idea of a miraculously saved Tsar. They saw that there was no true sovereign, only chaos led by a former serf. Their interests, in essence, diametrically opposed the aspirations of the peasants and serfs, who dreamed of complete freedom and the destruction of the nobility as a class. In November 1606, in the midst of the Moscow siege, when Shuisky's position seemed hopeless, noble detachments led by Prokopy Liapunov and Istli Pashkov committed an act of betrayal. Intercepting one of the miraculously saved Tsar's charters, which contained calls for the extermination of boyars and nobles, they realized that they would face the same fate as the Moscow boyars. This was not just a defection, but a stab in the back, exposing the inherent instability and contradictions of his army. The nobles defected to Vasily Shuisky, swearing allegiance to him, and then, uniting with the Tsar's voivodes, attacked Bolotnikov's main forces. This betrayal became a turning point, the last fatal mistake, which did not belong to Bolotnikov himself, but was inherent in the very nature of his rebellion. The illusion of the true Tsar could not hold together such polar social strata. After such a blow, the battle that took place on December 2, 1606, near the village of Kolomenskoye, was not just a defeat, but a true catastrophe that turned the tide of the rebellion. Bolotnikov's forces were routed, losing thousands of men. The detachments that had besieged Moscow just yesterday retreated in panic. A painful, tragic withdrawal began. Bolotnikov, retaining only a part of his forces, retreated first to Kaluga and then to Tula, where he hoped to entrench himself and make a final stand. But the noose was tightening. The Tsar Vasily Shuisky, having been on the verge of defeat, demonstrated unexpected cunning. He did not storm Tula, but ordered the Upa River, on which the city stood, to be dammed. The water rose, flooding the city streets, warehouses, and cellars, depriving the besieged of supplies and the ability to defend themselves. This was a brilliant but cruel decision that put Bolotnikov and his supporters in a desperate situation. After a 4-month grueling siege, when hunger and disease were killing people by the dozens, and the hope for the arrival of the true Tsar finally faded, Ivan Bolotnikov decided to surrender. In October 1607, under Vasily Shuisky's promise to spare the lives of all rebels, he opened the gates of the Tula Kremlin. This was a last, desperate act, dictated by faith in the Tsar's word, or perhaps by the realization of complete collapse. However, as was often the case during the time of troubles, promises were worthless. Immediately after his surrender, Bolotnikov was seized, and a few days later, on October 27th in Kargopol, he was blinded and then drowned. His death, devoid of any grandeur, became a symbol of the final exposure. The myth of the true Tsar did not save his voivode, but only cast him into an abyss from which there was no return. Even Bolotnikov, the former slave who became a banner of rebellion, drowned in his own lie, becoming a victim of the very illusion he so fiercely defended. Bolotnikov's death did not bring the Russian Tsardom the long-awaited peace. On the contrary, his massive rebellion, suppressed so cruelly, only plunged the country deeper into chaos and anarchy, leaving behind a trail of catastrophic consequences that were felt for years. For Tsar Vasily Shuisky, suppressing the rebellion was a tactical success that allowed him to retain the throne, but strategically, his position did not improve. Shuisky's legitimacy, based on his election by a narrow circle of boyars, remained disputed, and the brutal reprisal against Bolotnikov and his associates only intensified popular hatred for the boyar Tsar. Power remained fragile, hanging by a thread, and any new spark could ignite a fire with renewed force. The country's economy, already ravaged by the Great Famine and the early years of the Troubles, received another devastating blow. The lands through which the rebellion swept lay in ruins. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, the population either perished or fled. Peasants, driven to despair, abandoned their plots, swelling the ranks of vagrants and bandits. This led to a sharp reduction in cultivated land and, consequently, to a drop in tax revenues to the treasury. The state, desperately in need of funds to maintain the army and restore order, was on the verge of bankruptcy. Financial resources were depleted, forcing Shuisky to resort to unpopular measures, such as raising taxes, exacerbating the already difficult situation of the people. The political consequences were no less destructive. Bolotnikov's rebellion finally eroded trust in central authority in the southern and southwestern peripheries, where the rebellion had received the most support. These regions virtually ceased to obey Moscow, becoming hotbeds of constant instability, ready to embrace any new impostor. The nobility, though they had sided with Shuisky, realized their vulnerability in the face of popular anger. This strengthened their desire to tighten serfdom, seeing it as the only guarantee of preserving their estates and power, which only exacerbated social contradictions and alienation between the estates. The Cossack communities, which played a key role in the rebellion, were not completely crushed. They merely dispersed, retaining their military might and readiness for new campaigns under any convenient banner. Their freebooting became an even more dangerous and uncontrollable force. Thus, the suppression of Bolotnikov's rebellion was not the end of the time of troubles, but merely its new, even more brutal phase. It revealed the central government's inability to solve the deep-seated problems of the state, exposed cracks in the social structure, and demonstrated how easily millions of people could be drawn into a destructive struggle under the banner of deception. The Russian throne remained unstable, and the country, bleeding, found itself defenseless against external threats that were not long in coming. This was not a victory, but merely a temporary respite before a new, more terrible whirlwind. However, Ivan Bolotnikov's death, devoid of grandeur, did not erase his name from popular memory. On the contrary, it paradoxically elevated him to a pedestal, creating a myth that proved far more resilient than the truth itself. The former slave, galley oarsman, who had merely been an instrument in others' hands, was reinterpreted as a folk hero, a martyr, a fighter for justice, whose rebellion became a symbol of irreconcilable struggle against oppressors. This transformation was not accidental. In a country exhausted and tormented by the time of troubles, where all traditional pillars were crumbling, the people desperately needed a symbol of resistance, a figure who could embody their pain and hope. The inconvenient truth about Bolotnikov, that he was a pawn in a large game, blinded by another's lie, proved too bitter. It was far easier to accept the myth of the peasant leader who, though he perished, raised the banner against the boyar Tsar. His defeat did not diminish his symbolic significance. Rather, it arguably enhanced it, transforming him from a deceived rebel into a tragic hero who fell for the popular cause. This is precisely where the central paradox of his legacy lies. A man devoid of strategic genius, or a true ideology, whose rebellion was built on deceit and the ambitions of others, nevertheless entered history as the embodiment of popular anger and the yearning for freedom. His story offers a universal lesson on how, amidst total despair and social disintegration, myth can supersede reality, and the collective need for a hero or martyr can rewrite biographies. It matters little who Ivan Bolotnikov truly was. What is significant is how history shaped him to make sense of the unimaginable. He emerged not merely as a figure from the past, but as a timeless reminder of the